Hello everyone and welcome back. Today on this lesson we are going to talk about solving quadratics. In the previous lesson that we did earlier we talked about factoring quadratics. So we actually had to know how to factor quadratics for this lesson. So this is kind of the continuation of that factoring quadratic lesson that we just did earlier in the week. So for today we are actually going to solve this equation by factoring. So there's that factoring, which is what we learned in that previous lesson. So when I look at my equation, and I know it's an equation because it has an equal sign, so when I get done with my problem, I ultimately want to have my variable equaling some value. I know this is also a quadratic because if I look at my highest degree is a 2, which is telling me that it's a quadratic function. Technically, there are multiple ways in order to solve a quadratic function. One is by factoring, which is what we're going to focus on today in this lesson. Another way is you can actually use the quadratic formula. And another way is also by graphing. You can graph this quadratic function, and finding out where it equals 0 is actually where this one is going to be crossing the x-axis. And those values in which it crosses the x-axis is going to give you a solution to this quadratic. And like I said a moment ago, but we're only going to focus on factoring for this lesson. So remembering what we had learned from the previous lesson when it came to factoring, we're going to kind of see if we can streamline our factoring a little bit. So when we did this in the previous lesson, we made the x and we knew that the top was a times c and the bottom was b. My pin still hasn't came in yet. We're getting closer. I know that shipping is being delayed on a lot of times or on a lot of items, so I'm being patient. So I'm hoping you're being patient with my penmanship as well. Sorry. So anywho, so we sat there and came up with our little x factor. We figured out our other values over here, and then we ended up simplifying it from there. So when it comes to some quadratics, and especially when our a is 1, I'm going to kind of step forward a little bit and kind of streamline this process a little bit. So we know that if we are solving by factoring, we need to come up with factors. And in the last lesson, we knew that factors meant what we multiply by in order to get that original value or that original number. So we ultimately want to find those numbers or those factors that when we multiply them is going to give us our quadratic. And when we worked through that problem, we knew that we had these two factors, right? So we want to figure out what those two factors are, and we want to set it equal to 0. We don't want to kind of skip around and only write down part of our problem. You always want to try and keep everything in your problem and not, some people will just write the factors and then wait until the very end to set it equal to 0. You're setting yourself up to possibly forget something. So my rule of thumb is always keep everything that you got going on, right? All right. So when I factor this, my quadratic, I know that my a is 1. So this is where it makes it where we don't have to necessarily use the whole x and factoring it that way. So the way that I do it is some people refer to it as kind of like the FOIL method. So in order to get x squared, I know that I have to multiply numbers together to get x squared. And the only way that I know how to get x squared is if I do x times x, right? So just like when we were doing the whole thing with our our Xbox or our area model or however we want to call this, we did this a times c and put it on top. And instead of making this, I'm just going to try and do it in my head. So I know that my a is 1 and my c is negative 15. So 1 times negative 15 is negative 15, right? So I know I have to get a negative number. And the only way that I know how to get a negative number is if I multiply a positive and a negative together. Now to get my negative 15, I have to think of my factors on how to get 15. And when I look at those factors, I want to be able to add them together and get negative 2. So to get negative 15, I can do some kind of combination of 1 times 15, but that is not going to get me to negative 2. So my next option is 3 times 5, and if I multiply 3 and 5 together, I can get a negative 2. So in order to get the negative 2, I need my 5 to be negative and my 3 to be positive. And at this point, you can kind of stop for a second and check yourself, right? 3 times negative 5 is going to give me negative 15, and 3 minus 5 is going to give me my negative 2. And if we can say that with certainty, and we know that that multiplication and that addition is correct, then we can move on to the next part. So now that we have our factors, and we have our factors are equal to 0, there's this little thing called the zero property, the zero product property. I'm going to try and write it, right? Maybe. The zero product property. And what this is ultimately saying, product in mathematics means what? Right, multiplication. So when we multiply these numbers together, we're getting 0. So if I'm multiplying some number together, so let's say a number A times another number B, and I want that to equal 0. So the zero product property says that in order to multiply two numbers together to equal 0, one of those two numbers, either the A or the B, has to equal 0. So either A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0, right? So if my A, I don't know, pick a number. What number you want to pick? 7? All right, 7. So if I put in 7 for A and I want it to equal 0, what does my B have to be? My B has to be 0, right? So we can use that same property when it comes to our quadratic, because just like A and B are factors, that x plus 3 and that x minus 5 is factors. So then I know that either x plus 3 has to equal 0 or x minus 5 has to equal 0. Now I can solve these two equations, right? So to get x all by itself, I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides and get x equals 3. Sorry, I apologize. X equals negative 3. Or on this one, I'm going to add 5 to both sides and get x equals 5, right? And then there are my solutions. And I know that I have solutions because when it comes to solving, I want to get my variable on one side and my number on the other side, right? That means I've solved it. I've gotten my x all by itself. So let's do one more example and kind of spice it up a little bit. Sound good? Thanks. All right. So on this one we get 7x squared plus 13x plus 6. So really the only thing is we got to factor this guy. And when it comes to our factoring, we worked on factoring these types of problems when our A was greater than 1, right? So in the first thing we always did if our A was greater than 1 was look at our quadratic to see if there's anything that can be factored out. And I don't see anything that can be factored out. So I'm going to jump right into the whole thing of making our little x and factoring this, right? So if I have my x, A times C goes on top, right? So 7 times 6 is 42, and I have 13 on the bottom, my B, right? Boop, boop. So now I need to find numbers that when I multiply them together, or factors, when I multiply them together, I end up getting 42, a positive 42. So they either got to be positive, positive, or negative, negative. And this is telling me they have to be positive, positive. So in order to get 42, I'm going to go through all of my factors. And I know that my factors are going to be a 7 and a 6, right? And I'm just going to add my x onto here, because I want this to be my middle term, right? So 7x plus 6x is my 13x. So now I'm going to rewrite this, and instead of writing it as my three terms, I'm going to write it as 1, 2, 3, 4 terms, right? So I'm going to get 7x squared plus 7x plus 6x plus 6 equals 0. Don't forget our equals 0. And this is the same thing as this, We just wrote it as 4 terms instead of 3 terms. So now I'm going to see if I can put some things together. So I'm going to put these two together. So between 7x squared and 7x, I want to see what I can factor out, or what they have in common. And they have a 7x in common. And that's going to leave me with x plus 1. Right? Then I'm going to do the same thing over here, and I'm going to put these two terms together, and I'm going to see what I can factor out. And I know that I can factor out a 6. And after I factor out a 6, I'm left with x plus 1, and I know those equal 0. Right? So now I'm going to look at my quadratic that I've started to factor, and I'm going to see if there's another term they have in common that I can factor out. And I can factor out this x plus 1 because they have them in common. So I'm going to factor out my x plus 1. And when I pull that x plus 1 out to the front, I'm left with 7x plus 6. And I know those equal 0. Equals 0. My zero product property tells me that either this factor or this factor has to equal 0. So either x plus 1 equals 0, or 7x plus 6 equals 0, right? Subtract 1 from both sides, and x equals negative 1. Or, so on this one we have a two-step equation, so the first thing we got to do is subtract the 6. So 7x equals negative 6, and then we can divide by 7 and get x equals negative 7/6. So one solution, or the second solution. Hope you guys understood the video. I hope it was clear. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.